what is at stake is not merely democracy in this country. What is at stake is culture and civilization itself. This regime is an unmitigated evil. How many people will they put in jail? How many? Cases against this Pinjra Tod activists, cases against Kafeel Khan. How many people will they charge for contempt?
So in your sense, how has the case eventually panned out, where finally the punishment that has been meted out to you is 1 rupee?
Well, I think eventually it has panned out quite well from my point of view, because I feel that it has successfully drawn attention to what has been going wrong in the Supreme Court in the last 6 years, how the Supreme Court's independence has been compromised, and how it has failed to do its job of defending democracy and fundamental rights of the people in the last 6 years. So this is one very good outcome of this whole controversy. The second thing that has happened is that it has emboldened, I found that very gratifying and surprising, that it has emboldened a lot more people, far from intimidating people against speaking out. It has emboldened a lot of people to speak out. So many people retweeted my tweet saying that if I was to be punished, so should they, and so on. So in that sense, I think it became a kind of freedom of speech movement in the country, and I think that's also a good outcome of this. One unfortunate fallout has been that it has unfortunately further strengthened the perception of the Supreme Court about its collapse and so on, and in that sense it has weakened the court further, which is not what I wanted, but it is one of the unfortunate fallouts of this whole controversy, or the manner in which it was handled.
And one of the things that has happened is that freedom of speech has become a topic of conversation. We are thinking about it, talking about it, examining what it means. And in that context, a lot of people pointed out, and you yourself would have had time to reflect on how you have, in the past, for example, quite publicly endorsed the punishment that was meted out to Justice Karwan over the same contempt of court case.
Yeah.
Have you had a rethink? Would you, how would you process it now?
You see, Justice Karwan's case was very different from my case. In Justice Karwan's case, it was not a freedom of speech issue. They convicted him for interfering with the administration of justice by passing orders from his residence without jurisdiction, ordering the arrest of Supreme Court judges and having them produced before him, etc. So it was not merely his accusing certain, of course, the allegations that he made were wild, but that by itself would not have been, in my view, a case for convicting and sentencing him to prison. But what he did went far beyond that. He abused his judicial office to pass orders which were clearly without jurisdiction and totally vexatious and obnoxious orders, ordering Supreme Court judges to be brought before him in chains and so on. And that is why an extraordinary thing happened, that the senior-most 7 judges of the Supreme Court took up his case and passed that order, saying that what he had been doing and saying was not only baseless, but it was also clear interference with the administration of justice. But having said that, perhaps it was not necessary to send him to prison, and it may have been enough to deprive him of judicial work and prevent him from doing what he was doing, creating a nuisance, a very serious nuisance for the judicial process.
So while this 1 rupee, punishment is being seen as a victory, of the people, of people who were rooting for you and of you. It's also true that a case like this, because they convicted you and gave a punishment, becomes something that will be cited again and again. And this whole scenario of people being punished for social media posts, this is a very, very dangerous trend.
No, I do not subscribe to the view that nobody can be punished for social media posts. So, for example, there are a number of people who are spreading hateful fake news through social media, which is not only false but also designed to create hatred and enmity between religious communities. That is a serious offense under the penal code, and that should certainly be stopped. But any comment on the functioning of any institution, however trenchant your criticism may be, that cannot be prevented by way of saying it is sedition. So, if you tweet against the government or against the Prime Minister, they say it's sedition. If you tweet against the court, they say it's contempt of court. This is totally wrong. So, and you see, contempt unfortunately is a jurisdiction, this scandalizing the court. Contempt is of three kinds: civil contempt, disobedience of court's orders. That's fine. Court's orders are meant to be obeyed, and therefore they need a sanction against disobedience. Then criminal contempt is in two parts. One is interfering with court proceedings or with the administration of justice. That also needs to be stopped and therefore should be a punishable offense. But the second part, which is scandalizing the court or lowering the authority of the court, that is problematic, because that is an offense by speech, and that is why we challenge that part of the Contempt of Courts Act by saying that that's an unreasonable restriction on the freedom of speech. You can only impose reasonable restrictions by law, but not this kind of vague and undefined jurisdiction in which judges sit as judges in their own cause. They are the accusers, they are the prosecutors, they are the judge, and therefore it's not a law which is in public interest at all, and that's why it's been abolished in all other countries, in UK, in America, and in most civilized countries.
Your tweets were meant to draw attention to wrongdoing within the judicial system. Now that you have a chance to speak more freely about it, what would you say is the main crisis in the judiciary today?
Now, there are many problems in the judiciary. We've been running a campaign for judicial accountability and reforms. See, at the first level, the judiciary is not accessible to the common people because it can't be accessed without lawyers. The procedural laws are too complex. Now, the Gram Nyayalaya Act and the Gram Nyayalayas were meant to address this problem, because these were supposed to be very simplified courts for small problems, which are the problems faced by ordinary people, and which would be at the sub-tehsil level, so to say, at the block level. But unfortunately, they have not been actualized. So, if a poor person is accused of a criminal offense, like say a street vendor, etc., he can't engage a lawyer. So, he is helpless, and that is why the majority of people in jails are under trials. They can't even arrange their bail. So, they just stand helplessly before the judge or the police. So, we need to have a simplified court system which people can access without the help of lawyers. This is one. Secondly, we need much better judges to man the courts. So, the process of selection of judges has to be made much more robust and transparent. Need to have a proper body which goes about selecting judges in a very systematic way, the way it is done in UK, etc. Then we need more courts, more judges, so that cases can be decided quickly. All cases normally should be decided within 6 months or so. And lastly, we need some accountability for judges. Today, you only have impeachment. There is that's a totally impractical and a political process. We have been saying for a long time that we need a fully independent and high-powered judicial complaints commission, to whom complaints against judges could be addressed and who should have the power to inquire into them and take action against judges. But nobody is interested, neither the government nor the judiciary is interested in any judicial accountability. And you see, accountability of the judiciary is further whittled down by again a Supreme Court declared law that no FIR can be registered against a judge without the prior permission of the Chief Justice of India. And very often the complaints are made against people who are friends of the Chief Justice of India, and therefore those complaints are just ignored or thrown away in the waste paper basket. And then you have the contempt law, so you can't even speak up against the judiciary without running against the threat of contempt. So therefore, it's a totally unaccountable judiciary. And even the independence, you see, that's also a problem. That independence has also been whittled down by this lure of post-retirement jobs, even though the judiciary has been given a lot of independence. They can't be touched by the government, but they can be offered post-retirement jobs in which the government does play a role. So we have always been of the view that the government should not play any role in post-retirement jobs for judges. There should be a judicial appointments commission, which should be a high-powered body independent of the government as well as of the judiciary. They should decide as to what kind of post-retirement jobs could be given to any judges. I am not against post-retirement jobs for judges. There are certain commissions, etc., for which retired judges are needed. And therefore, you can give them those jobs, but government should play no role in that. Then unfortunately, this government has been using other means also to compromise the independence of judges. Firstly, by interfering with the appointments. Even though today the Supreme Court Collegium of Senior Judges is supposed to decide about appointments, but unfortunately, this government has been just sitting on inconvenient appointments. They have not been appointing people that they don't want. They sit on it for years altogether. So, and this government is known to use the agencies, the IB, the CBI, the Income Tax, the Enforcement Directorate to target their political rivals, to target the media, to target business houses. And now it seems that they have also been targeting some sections of the judiciary in order to compromise their independence. So therefore, all these problems need to be addressed.
So the problems are, like you spelled out, vast, varied, and now even worse because the government seems to have no interest in trying to solve them. As a senior who has been watching this, who's been invested in this, where do you see the hope?
The hope has to lie with the people who are the consumers of justice. They are the real stakeholders in a system of justice. Unless those stakeholders, that is ordinary common people, rise up and start a movement or a campaign for judicial reforms and judicial accountability, unfortunately this is not going to happen, because judges and lawyers have a vested interest in the system. It is really the consumers of justice who need the courts for justice who are the real stakeholders. So they have to come forward.
What is your take on the power of the master of the roster?
So I feel that this is a very, very vast power, very important power, and it cannot be vested in just one person. We filed a petition in the Supreme Court saying that this power must be spread out at least among the top 5 judges of the Supreme Court, and they should collectively have a system by which they decide which benches should hear which kinds of cases, and thereafter those cases should go randomly to those benches. So suppose there are 3 benches to hear one particular kind of case, and if a case comes up, it should be randomly decided among those 3 benches, etc. This pick and choose, which is really there with the Chief Justice, is a very dangerous power to vest with one person, because if you then control the Chief Justice, then if the government can somehow control the Chief Justice by way of whatever, blackmail or otherwise, then they control the entire judiciary, because all politically sensitive cases can be sent to preferred benches in order to be decided in a particular way that the government may want.
You also, from the beginning of your career as a lawyer, worked very closely with some of the biggest social movements in India, the Narmada Bachao Andolan. And with that kind of a background of having taken up cases of corporate corruption as well as representing social movements, we are now again at a time where, like you said, we need the people to create a social movement. What have been your learnings? What do you think we need today? We've seen the anti-CA movement, and we've seen how the pandemic as well as the North Delhi violence kind of quashed it.
Whatever may be the cost that people have to occasionally pay in the short run for standing up against any kind of injustice. Now, the anti-CA movement was a very, very important movement, because they stood up against discrimination being done to Muslims in this country by way of the Citizenship Amendment Act. Now, it's true that the government has for the time being suppressed, or initially has suppressed that movement by these riots, by engendering riots and thereafter arresting activists in the name of these riots, etc. But this is not going to last for long, especially if people continue standing up and speaking out. And we are already seeing that all those cases are collapsing one after another. Cases against Kafeel Khan, cases against this Pinjra Tod activists, and various other cases are collapsing, and eventually they will collapse. And if enough people stand up, how many people will they put in jail? How many? So they can do it for a short while with a small number of people, but they can't do it if it becomes a large movement. For example, even in this contempt case, literally lakhs of people stood up and started saying the same thing. How many people will they charge for contempt? So
a lot of editorials, commentators are talking about how this moment is something that shows the power of one. You know, how you stood up at a time when everybody was feeling very deflated in terms of what the government is getting away with. And yet, like you said, we need a lot of people to rise. How do we build solidarity?
yeah, so I think people today must realize what is at stake. What is at stake is not merely democracy in this country. What is at stake is culture and civilization itself. The kind of culture and barbarity and fake news and diversion and unscientific thought and attack on critical thinking that is taking place today under this regime is something that will destroy all of us. And therefore, everybody has to realize that they must stand above their own egos, their own personal differences, and come together to fight this evil. I mean, it's an unprecedented evil that we are seeing today, unmitigated evil. This regime is an unmitigated evil. The country has never seen this kind of an evil regime. So, people need to bury their egos. One of the problems with activists that I have seen is their egos. and their petty egos come in the way of even small movements and solidarities, etc. And they need to go beyond that. I mean, perhaps one of the reasons why people came up in my support on this contempt issue is because I have been involved with so many movements, so many organizations, movements and so on, that by and large people do not see me as a person with a very big ego where I am trying to appropriate credit and so on. And perhaps that's one reason why people have come for my support. This is something which every activist should realize, that you see, if you do the work, then you get the credit automatically. You don't have to fight for any credit. People see who's working, just as the courts must realize that their credibility depends upon their judgments and their actions, not on what others may be saying. If somebody is leveling some absurd criticism, people see it for what it is.
If you go back to remember how you chose law, so you'd gone to IIT, then you went to Princeton, and you took a circuitous route in your education before you chose law. What was that final inspiration?
So my route was certainly very circuitous. I went to IIT thinking that every science-loving student should go to IIT. And I realized that engineering was not really what I was interested in. I was interested in physics. And plus at that time I was very homesick because of my kid sister who was 2 years old at that time. I was very fond of her. And so I decided to come back. When I came back, I had to do my class 12 intermediate. And that exam was in another 2-3 months. I came back in January, the exams were in March, April. So they didn't allow me to take physics and chemistry because I hadn't done the practicals. So I had to take mathematics and 2 new subjects. I took economics and logic. I found economics also very interesting because I studied Samuelson from cover to cover. I remember it was the 8th edition at that time. And so I decided that instead of repeating the year with physics, chemistry, I would do a BA with economics, political science and philosophy. By this time I had been introduced to Bertrand Russell and I got quite interested in philosophy as well. So I decided to do a BA with what is called a PPE. In Allahabad there weren't any honors at that time. But during my BA, my interest in philosophy kept growing, and after a year I lost interest in economics. So I wanted to do an MA in philosophy and a PhD and become an academic philosopher. But at that time, while I was still studying in my BA, Mrs. Gandhi's election case also took place, which I attended because my father was the counsel for Raj Narayan in that case. Thereafter I attended it in the Supreme Court also. Thereafter I attended the habeas corpus case hearings in the Supreme Court, and thereafter even the Keswanand Bharti review in the Supreme Court. So I got exposed to law at the very top, so to say, and I found that also quite interesting. But by the time I finished my BA, I wanted to really study philosophy. But people told me that, look, what will you do as an academic philosopher? You see the state of the philosophy departments. So I decided to formally study law, but informally I continued to study philosophy as well as physics on my own. By the time I was completing my law, I had become clear that I wanted to study philosophy. So I applied to a couple of American universities and I got a scholarship for a PhD program in philosophy of science at Princeton University, and I went to do a PhD in philosophy of science there. I had not yet completed my LLB final exam. I left it and went off. By the but thereafter when I reached there, I found that the kind of philosophy being done there was very different from what I was interested in. And for doing what I was interested in doing, philosophy of physics, I really needed to study physics for another 4 years or so. I needed to effectively do a PhD in physics before I could do the kind of work that I wanted to do. At that stage, I was not, didn't feel inclined to spend another 4 years studying physics. So then I came back and I did my final LLB final exam and then became a lawyer in 1983. That was the convoluted nature of my career. So at every stage I found that whenever some subject took my fancy, I studied it quite intensely. And thereafter, when I lost interest and got interested in something else, I studied that. And at the end, I found that none of that education really got wasted. If you study anything seriously, all that is useful in forming your overall perspective and understanding of things. So, I found all that education useful in my legal career as well.
Which has also been very unconventional. Your father Shanti Bhushan is one of the best known lawyers in India. His career and yours has been very different. And while you've been supportive of each other, perhaps at many times you have also been on opposite sides of cases or opposite sides of ideology or issues.
So one thing that I must say about my father is that he is the most liberal person that I have come across. He never stopped me from studying anything or pursuing any career. When I went to IIT, he said fine. When I left IIT, he said okay. When I studied economics, he said fine. When I studied philosophy, he said fine. He was of course happy that I studied law also. And he was happy when I became a lawyer finally. He wanted me to become a lawyer, but he never pushed me either way. Of course, his legal career and my legal career were very different. I got interested in public interest issues fairly early on. He was a conventional lawyer, very successful conventional lawyer who did cases for large companies, etc. I began fairly early on doing public interest cases, and because of my involvement in some public interest issues like Bhopal Gas or Narmada Bachao, my father also did some of those cases later on. But our thinking and ideologies were quite different to begin with, because with my exposure to public interest issues and to displaced people and Bhopal gas victims and street vendors and rickshaw pullers, etc., my ideology, I began to realize that our system is very heavily weighted against the poor and in favor of the wealthy and the privileged. And therefore, my economic philosophy and ideology were what you can consider to be left of center. While my father's economic philosophy and ideology were pretty much right of center, one can say. So we used to have occasionally very serious arguments, very loud arguments on our dinner table. But gradually I found that my father also gradually veered towards my way of thinking, at least on many issues. We may still not be ad idem on many issues, but gradually our ideologies have converged.
You always try to engage with the issues of the time, and sometimes there's no role model or there's no precedent. What, when you look back, would you do differently, or do you have any regrets? Did you something you wish you could do differently now?
No, I regret not having completed my science fiction novel, which I had once written in 1984. I had written a first draft, but thereafter I never got down to rewriting it because I felt. But in general, no, I don't particularly regret anything. I am happy that I pursued a convoluted career and a course of studying, etc. I am happy that I got involved in all these public interest issues. I am happy that I got involved in issues of judicial accountability. So personally,
you also joined politics with the Aam Aadmi Party.
Oh yes, that's one thing which I do regret. Yes, you are right. You see, at that time what happened was, this India Against Corruption movement, I didn't realize, and because I wasn't watching it closely enough, that it was heavily propped up by the BJP and the RSS, which became clear later on. And that Arvind had kind of back channel communications with the BJP RSS people. And unfortunately, that movement led indirectly to the rise of Narendra Modi and his coming to power, because it destroyed the Congress and it helped the BJP and Modi to come to power, who have emerged as far greater threats to the country, to our democracy, to our whole culture than the Congress could have been or was. So, in that sense, I do regret having not been able to see that the BJP and the RSS were propping it up for their own political reasons. And also, secondly, I also regret not being able to see Arvind's character early enough. I came to that realization that he was totally unscrupulous, willing to use any means, etc., when much later. I should have seen that much earlier. So, in a way, I kind of inadvertently facilitated his rise to power. And I realized that I have allowed another kind of Frankenstein to grow in a way.
One of the lesser known parts of your work is the Samfna Institute, which has offered a lot of support to big and small groups. What is it that you were trying to achieve?
So, over the years, in my interactions with some of the finest activists in this country, I realized that a really good activist who understands that issue properly and who can strategically engage on that issue, whether it's say the issue of nuclear energy or the issue of dams, etc., those who understand it and those who also understand how you can effectively engage with the government and with civil society to steer that policy in the direction of public interest, then such activists have been very effective. So, I felt that we need to set up an institute where such activists, especially on issues of various public policies of public interest, could be educated and trained in order to steer public policies towards public interest. That was the whole object of this institute.
Okay, my last question is, like you said, it's a time of the nation and society facing this unprecedented, unmitigated evil. We not only have to get through the next 4 years, we have to make sure that we do not have a situation where the Modi government comes back for another 5 years or just destroys the electoral system. What is it that we need to do differently now?
Firstly, of course, everybody needs to be active at this time. They need to firstly take an interest in what's happening, speak out about what's happening. That doesn't take much. To see what's happening, take an interest in it and speak up. Thereafter, we need to plan strategically to take up issues in order of priority and strategic interest, and then develop solidarities and organizations and movements, etc., so that those issues can be taken up in an organized and strategic manner. So that's what people need to do.
This sense that the people seem to want this hateful politics, that a large section of society has gone over. How do you deal with it? Do you feel despair?
Yes, I do feel disheartened, certainly, that so many people have been infected with this communal virus, which has been spread in a very organized way by the BJP's hate machine and the BJP RSS hate machine. And we need to disinfect people from that virus by firstly, this is an offense, as I said. We need to lodge FIRs against people who are spreading this fake and hateful news, etc. And secondly, we also need to spread our own message that look, cultural, religious diversity is an asset for any society. And India has the widest cultural and religious diversity. That's a great asset for this country. And we need to educate people that this is an asset, about the benefits of a multicultural, multi-religious society, how people can actually benefit from the good things of other cultures, other religions, other cuisines, and so on. So that message needs to be spread by social media, by the internet media, etc., whatever media is there at our command, and also by word of mouth. So that's what people need to do.
Thank you.
Thank you.